Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Everyone, welcome to Talking Tudors, episode 171, and the fourth instalment of All Things 16th Century Women. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. Over August and September, we'll be exploring the lives of 16th century women through a series of podcast episodes right here on Talking Tudors and video lectures which will be published on my YouTube channel, so be sure to subscribe. While all the content is free, I ask that you consider supporting my work and the event by becoming a Talking Tudors patron. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Join the Talking Tudors patron family, and in addition to receiving lots of Tudor-themed goodies, you'll have access to patron-only monthly giveaways. August's prize is a copy of Dr Estelle Perronc's brilliant new book, Blood, Fire and Gold, the story of Elizabeth I and Catherine de' Medici. Thank you to Dr Perronc for sponsoring this wonderful prize. All patrons are also eligible to attend monthly Talking Tudors live talks, which take place on Zoom. These events are exclusive to patrons. On the weekend of the 20th and the 21st of August, I'll be chatting to Adrian Dillard about Jane Seymour and Marjorie Horseman. Details are published on Patreon. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. There are a number of designs and products available, including phone cases, mugs, notebooks, and apparel. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. I would love to see pics of you wearing or using your Talking Tudors merch, so please do tag me on social media and use the hashtag #ILoveTalkingTudors. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that joining me on the show to talk about shaping femininity is Dr. Sarah Bendall. Sarah Bendall is a research fellow at the Gender and Women's History Research Centre, Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences at the Australian Catholic University. She's a material culture and dress historian whose work focuses on the role of gender in the production, trade and consumption of global commodities and fashionable consumer goods between 1500 and 1800. Sarah is the author of Shaping Femininity, Bloomsbury 2021. Our conversation's coming up straight after this short musical break, courtesy of guitarist Jon Sayles. Welcome to All Things 16th Century Women. How are you, Sarah?
I'm well, thanks. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, I'm very excited about our chat today. So let's just start by you just introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Sarah Bendall, and I call myself a material culture historian. I mainly focus on dress history though, so early modern, so 16th, 17th, and slowly venturing into the 18th centuries. So I'm a research fellow in the Gender and Women's History Research Centre at the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne.
Fantastic. Excellent. It's always lovely to speak to a fellow Aussie. It doesn't
I know.
happen too often. So let's start by maybe just telling us a little bit about how important clothing was during the 16th century.
Yeah, I mean, clothing was incredibly important. I mean, for various reasons. Some of them, we're very familiar with today. It shelters us from the elements, provides warmth. The thing that made clothing extremely important during the early modern period, particularly the 16th century, was this idea that, and the 16th century is when this idea about clothes maketh the man or woman first come about. So it's really this idea that from someone's clothing, you should be able to tell quite a lot about them. And, some of these things we still have now. Clothing was about self-expression. And, definitely in the past, people expressed themselves through their clothing. But in this period in the 16th century, I would say what made clothing so important was that it really was supposed to reflect your sort of social status or station in life. And that's because it was heavily regulated. So we had sumptuary legislation, which did regulate what certain people of certain classes could and could not wear. England wasn't quite as full on when it came to sumptuary legislation, in different parts of Europe. I know in some of the German provinces, for example, there are very specific things that you could and could not wear, like items of clothing you could and could not wear based on your social status. In England, it was more about the fabrics that you could and could not wear. But yeah, so I'd say clothing was really important because you were supposed to be able to, from what somebody was wearing, make a very genuine assessment of who they were, what their background was, where they sort of sat in the social ladder. And that became even more important when you're an elite person who, can access particular types of clothing, and that you were able to wear certain types of clothing. So once you get to sort of anybody who is landed or aristocratic, there are sort of very strict rules about what types of fabric you can wear, on what you can wear it, on what occasions, you may be able to wear certain things that on other occasions you can't. So there's this whole unwritten world, I guess, of etiquette when it came to clothing that we're sort of unraveling, but it was really so you could place people within your world.
Yeah, I think imagine if we were just sort of dropped there, there'd be so much that we'd need to learn in terms of etiquette. Because I remember reading somewhere that obviously, the colors that you could wear also strictly guarded, I suppose, and the amount of fabric that you could have in your clothing. So it would be very confusing for a stranger, wouldn't it?
Yeah, if you went back in a time machine, you'd have to be so careful. But there's still so much that we don't understand. So you could very easily get yourself in trouble.
Absolutely. So what was the ideal female silhouette at this time in the 16th century? And I know this changed over the decades, so maybe if you tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so during the 16th century, I'd say the predominant ideal and this really applies to both men and women's bodies. I mean, my research focuses more on women, but there is interesting sort of overlaps between the silhouette of men and women in the 16th century and I'll talk about the early 17th century as well. And I think when I refer to 16, just because the Jacobean period is quite similar continuity wise to the Elizabethan period. But you get a lot of descriptions of the ideal female body, for example, and these also apply to men's bodies as being straight and slender. So that basically meaning not only are you slender, are you skinny, but straight and upright. And that's really why you get garments like men's doublets, but also why you get the start of corsetry in this period. So pairs of bodies is what they're called in this period. And those garments are really designed to create this sort of elongated, straight, slim torso. And so most men and women's bodies, if you look at paintings, and, even before corseted pairs of bodies come about in the Elizabethan period, if you look to the courts of Henry VIII, for example, there you can see this sort of silhouette on both men and women, this sort of inverted triangular shape and they look quite flat and slim. And that really was the ideal of the period, and their clothing reflected that. So it created this sort of like optical illusions of slim and straightness. Georges Vigarello, who's a French social historian, has talked about this a lot. He sort of calls it the uprightness of the body. So he's looked at how in France, and this happens in England as well. And I mean, this is mainly talking about men's bodies. So it's sort of even more extreme for women, how there's this gradual shift to this emphasis of having good deportment. So we would say good posture, and that which really is sort of reflected in this sort of upright, straight body. And so that's really what you get during this period. And, you know, added on to that for women, I would say the other ideal in the torso is small breasts. I know there's sort of, I don't know how accurate it is, but there's sort of this rumor, for example, that Henry VIII liked small breasts. So and so, you know, and it really is, it is a thing in this period, and actually dating back to the medieval period, large breasts were seen as uncomely and slightly provocative, but in a negative way. But also, you know, it might have indicated that you weren't young and sort of perky anymore, and that really does carry through to the 16th century as well. So that sort of, when it comes to torsos, it's this long, lean, small breasts for women. And then as you move in throughout the period, you start to get sort of skirts varying different volumes. Men's breeches, for example, are also quite voluminous at different times. And then this silhouette really carries through to the 17th century. And it's not really, and, you know, at different times in the 17th century, maybe breasts are emphasized more at different stages, but it really sort of stays this conical shape, not quite as long as the Elizabethan period, through to the 18th century, actually. There's still this like emphasis on good posture and shoulders back. And it doesn't really change for women until the 19th century, which is when you get more of this hourglass shape.
Yeah, I always marvel at some of the Tudor portraits, especially the Elizabethan ones, where their waists are like tiny, and you wonder, gosh, what's going on there? And even Elizabeth I, is it her funeral?
Her funeral effigy. Pair of bodies is tiny, and
like, I think that real?
Yeah, I mean, my hypothesis, I guess, is that it was definitely made by her tailor, and it's likely based on examples that the Queen had. So when the Queen died, there was a warrant put out that they needed it was a pair of drawers and a pair of bodies made for her effigy, which then they took obviously clothing from her wardrobe and put it on. And it was made very quickly. So I'd say it was either patterns that were already sitting around, or it's definitely based on something that she already owned. Whether or not they cut it down and made it a bit smaller for the effigy, that's a possibility. But Elizabeth I was always described as fitting this ideal body shape. There's various descriptions of her as being tall and straight and slender.
So you've described the ideal look that women were obviously going for in this period, and you've also touched on some of the garments used to help you get that look. But can you maybe go into that a little bit more and just tell us about those main foundation garments that women are wearing at this time?
Yeah, of course. So in the 16th century, you start to have the first foundation garments. So by foundation, I mean the sort of structured undergarments that really create the shape of the period. And, you know, these sort of foundations garments can be seen in various different variations up until the 20th century. And I mean, now we wear shapewear. So it's really the garments that sort of give you that ideal silhouette of the period. In the late 15th century, there's something called a farthingale that comes about in Spain. So a farthingale is a structured underskirt, although in Spain in the late 15th century, it can also be part of the outer skirt as well. So there's sort of three main types of farthingales during the 16th century. So you get the Spanish farthingale, which is what it was called in England. And that is the skirt that had come from Spain in sort of the early 16th century. So Catherine of Aragon is wearing one when she arrives in England to marry, but she doesn't really wear it for the first sort of couple of decades that she's in England. There's been, you know, lots of people say that she popularizes it in England, but really it doesn't come into fashion in England till about the 1540s. So this is a classic sort of hooped skirt with round hoops. And then in the 1540s, that becomes quite popular in England. So that's when you sort of start to see it in different wardrobes. For Princess Elizabeth, for example, gets her first one in the early 1540s. And then in the So that was quite popular until about the 1570s. And then you start to get descriptions of what the English called French farthingales. So obviously fashion for farthingales that had come from France. And we're not exactly sure what these garments looks like. There's no surviving examples. There's only one surviving example of a Spanish farthingale, and that one is in Spain, also on another effigy. But we think French farthingales were sort of two different types. So unlike a Spanish farthingale, which was a hoop skirt that sort of went down to your ankles from your waist, French farthingales seem to have sat around the waist. And so the majority of the bulk of the skirt is around the waist. So we think the first one was like a roll that sat around the waist of various different sizes. And then sort of by the 1590s, at that, that sort of last stage of Elizabeth's life where her clothing is just, to us, sort of outrageous and like crazy, we think she wears a type of French farthingale, which really is like a disc that sort of comes out from the waist, and that creates, and that's quite popular in the Jacobean period as well. So it really creates that, I guess, that flat surface that you see with their skirts, and then there's like this plateau. And so that's one type of foundation garment, is the farthingale. And the other type, which I mentioned before, was a pair of bodies. So in the 16th century, bodies basically referred to the torso covering garment, and this is where we get the modern word bodice from. There's sort of various different stiffening going on with, in the court of Henry VIII, for example, their bodices or their bodies are often stiffened with pasteboard or rabbit skin glue, but there's no boning per se. And it's not until the 1590s that you start to get what we would think as like as a corset. So these sort of boned torso garments that are called straight bodies or French bodies. Again, French because the influence is coming from France in England. And those, as we all know, stay in fashion and in use right up until, well, I was going to say the 20th century, but there's just basically recently been a huge fashion trend of corsets again. So we're still doing it now.
Isn't it funny how the fashion just comes around every so
I know,
often?
it's so interesting. I mean, great for me who, just published a book.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of people asking me about corsets. So it's really like nice to be able to go back to the start and tell people about them.
Absolutely. And when I was doing a little bit of research, I came across the Busk and some information that you'd given about this and its association with love and sexual desire. So I was wondering if you could talk to us about that.
Yeah, of course. The Busk is fascinating. It was in my honors year at university that I first came across the Busk, and that's sort of what set me down this rabbit hole, I guess, of my PhD and my research, my book. So the Busk was a long piece of hard material, so quite often wood or metal, or it could be horn, or it could be quite a thick piece of whale baleen. And it was placed down the center front of the pair of bodies, or in the 18th century pair of stays. And it was still actually used in the 19th century in corsetry up until about the mid 19th century. And so, it was this long flat piece of rigid material. And basically its use in fashion was to stop you from slouching. So again, to create this upright, straight body shape that is, so desired in the 16th century. And, men's doublets, they didn't have a bust, but they would often have sort of bits of boning down the center front next to the buttons, which served a similar function. So where the bust becomes really fascinating, though, is it is an accessory that could be taken in and out of clothing. So in the late 16th century, you start to get descriptions in plays and satires of men inscribing busks with love tokens, with sometimes like quite raunchy sort of sayings, and giving them to their sweethearts or to someone that they're wooing or courting. So this tradition sort of, it begins in the 16th century. I mean, I've only looked at it in the English and the French context, but it sort of, definitely starts in both in the late 16th century. And it's quite interesting. At first, it's quite like sexualized and discussed in quite a bawdy manner. And so the bow, there was a bow that women would tie it into their bodies with. And that's where we hypothesize that, a lot of modern bras still have the little bow in the middle.
Right.
That's maybe where that comes from. But there's also discussion of women giving men that was called a busk point. so bits of ribbon, and women giving those to men in return as love tokens. And so this tradition continues through the 17th century, and by the late 17th, 18th century, it's sort of, you still get sort of the bawdy jokes about these objects, but they're very much tied with courtship rituals that have developed over that preceding sort of 100 years, and sort of these associations with romantic love. So yeah, if you were a man courting a woman, you might give her lots of little love tokens, and one of them might have been a busk.
So fascinating. And do we have surviving examples from the 16th century?
Yeah, so the great thing about busks is, because of the nature of them being these sort of hard materials, a lot have survived. So the majority of busks that have survived that have inscriptions on them date to the 17th century, but we know that they were inscribing them in the 16th century from written record. But the ones that survive from the 16th century tend to be quite decorative. So there's some in the Victorian Albert Museum. There's some French ones made of ivory. And then there's actually quite a few Italian and French examples in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York as well. Unfortunately, yeah, none from the 16th century have inscriptions to my knowledge, but they are really beautiful to look at.
Oh, fantastic. I can see myself, in another rabbit hole looking at pictures.
Yeah, if you just type in Busk, B-U-S-K, to the Met catalogue, it'll bring them all up.
Oh,
they're
fantastic.
So interesting.
Looking forward to that. All right. So in terms of foundation garments, were they worn, did all women wear these up and down the social scale, or was it more predominantly aristocratic and royal women?
Yeah, so that was something that I really wanted to look at in my research, because I think, in a lot of the literature that I read or speaking to different people, there was this notion that non-aristocratic women didn't wear these garments until much later, even into, the mid to late 18th centuries. But in my research, I found that they were actually a lot more widely worn much earlier than we thought. So they start off as aristocratic garments. They, again, sort of complement all these ideas to do with the aristocracy in the 16th century. So sort of the theatricality of the courts in the 16th century, these ideals of the aristocratic body, which are very much this sort of slender and straight and upright deportment. Obviously good posture projects power, it projects confidence. There was a lot of concerns about, having good bloodlines and good breeding. So, you didn't want any physical deformities or anything like that could indicate that there might be something, not wrong. Well, wrong at the time, I guess they considered it to be with your family. And, farthingales, for example, complement ideas of wealth. So the bigger your skirt, the more fabric you needed to cover it, which means the more money you had to have, because fabric during the 16th century and the 17th century as well is incredibly expensive. So whereas now, I guess, labor and fabric is cheap and clothing is cheap, in the 16th century, fabric was incredibly expensive and labor was cheap. And so most people's clothing across the social scale, but definitely, the more clothing and more expensive clothing you had, it really was stored wealth. And so, when we hear about, by the 18th century, people being sent to places like Australia, to the penal colonies, because they stole a piece of clothing, like, we think that's quite extreme, but clothing was extremely expensive, which is why a lot of people didn't have a lot of clothes unless they were the elites. But nevertheless, I found in my research that sort of by the early to mid 17th century, you start to get a lot more women wearing these garments. So I would say the middle classes start to wear them. Probably by I found yeoman farmers' wives that have them in their wardrobes in the 1620s, servants by the middle of the 17th century. In the 16th century, you'd be more likely, if you weren't aristocrat or gentry, to be wearing one of these garments. Maybe if you're a servant in the household gentry or aristocracy and you are seen with your lady, because it's sort of, she might hand things down to you, or you need to dress in a way that reflects her social standing. But I have found a couple of women in the late 16th century who one seems to be the wife of a clerk, and the other comes from quite a wealthy merchant family. So these women aren't aristocratic, they're not gentry, they're probably quite wealthy middling sorts, and they both have farthingales. So yeah, you sort of start to see this trickle-down effect that happens. So these garments start as aristocratic garments, and then over the course of the 16th century and then the 17th century, they start to sort of be more widely worn. Until by the 18th century, I would argue that the majority of women would have worn, even if not every day, they would have worn some sort of foundation garment. If it wasn't brand new, they could have bought it secondhand, they could have been gifted it.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. So, Sarah, how did these garments help shape not just bodies, but shape and define notions of femininity in early modern England?
Yeah, so that was, I guess, the overarching argument of my book, Shaping Femininity. And I sort of argue that in many ways, these garments did shape our notions of femininity, or at least aided in the sort of changing expressions of those notions. So the sort of question I always come down to, which was one that struck me quite early on in my research, was that in sort of, for example, the late 16th century, if you were wearing a pair of bodies or a corset, you could be labeled, to use the word they would use at the time, a whore. Whereas by the end of the 17th century, if you're not wearing a pair of bodies or a corset, you're labeled a whore. So there's like this huge transition in expectations of women and how women should look and how their deportment should be, how they should behave. And I think these garments aid in those expressions of femininity, but also helped to people to, I guess, navigate those expressions of femininity. And particularly in this period, there's a lot of men writing about women, a lot of men writing about what women should and shouldn't do. And they have a lot to say about foundation garments. But what they're saying and what women are doing are often two different things. So there's this really interesting, complex interplay between, I guess, men trying to regulate fashion and shaping the discourse that is happening around fashion and why women should and shouldn't wear certain things. So, for example, there's quite a lot of discussion in the 16th and the 17th centuries about women's bodies and how can we see what women's bodies are really like when they're wearing something like a farthingale. Like, how do we know if they're pregnant or not? How do we know if they're disabled or deformed, using their terminology at the time? Like, what are women hiding under these skirts? Then there's anxiety about women hiding illegitimate pregnancies, and there's anxiety when it comes to corsetry about women using them to get rid of pregnancies that they don't want, and things like that. And so these garments become this sort of center point of a lot of these discussions and really help to shape the discussions that men and women are having about female behavior and how they should be. And so that's sort of really where that idea of like shaping femininity comes through from. It doesn't just shape the way that women physically and the silhouette should look. It really starts to shape a lot of the discourses about women's bodies, about beauty. And I mean, the fact I think that we're still talking about corsetry now, it really sort of starts these 500 years of discussions about, how women should look, how women should behave, and like what women's appearances says about her as an individual, but women as, a group of people as well. Yeah, that's where shaping femininity comes from.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And if everyone listening, that's Shaping Femininity, Sarah's book. We didn't mention it in the introduction, but you can go and have a look at that great book to find out more information about what we're discussing. So we've talked a lot about the garments, but I'm always interested to hear about the people making them, the artisans who made and sold these garments. So what did you find out about those people?
Yeah, so the artisans I find so fascinating because the transition from the 16th to the 17th century is quite interesting in the way that the organization of artisans changes. And then again, by the 18th century, it's quite different again. So it was really interesting in the book to sort of look at who was making these different things. So if the majority of the 16th century, a woman's clothing would have been primarily made by both a seamstress, who was usually a woman, you could have male sempsters, who were sewing her linen undergarments. So that would be your smock or your shift, maybe, a cloth, different sorts of linen goods. You might have a hosier simultaneously who's making your stockings. But all of your outer garments would have been made by a tailor, and a tailor was usually male. And this is because the guild structure at the time, the way that you were trained, was really only open to men, wasn't so much open to women. So yeah, usually a seamstress was a woman and a tailor was a man, although that's not totally set in stone. The more research we do, the more we find that actually this may have been a little bit more fluid, especially by the end of the 17th century. For most of the 16th century, you would have had a seamstress and a tailor. And then what was really interesting in looking at these garments was that by the end of the 16th century, you start to have this specialization of professions taking place. So for example, and you can see this really clearly through Elizabeth I's wardrobes. So for the majority of her reign, her clothing was made by a tailor. And then, her majority of her life as a princess, and then the first half of her reign by a tailor. And then the 1570s, she has a designated farthingale maker. So this was a man, there were two different men at various stages, who their role in the wardrobe was just to make farthingales. And so these were men who obviously trained as tailors, and then they saw this specialization where they could just specialize in making one thing. And then by the 1590s, when she starts wearing pairs of bodies, they're still made by her tailor. And actually all the queens in the 17th century, their pairs of bodies are made by their tailors. But by looking at guild records in London, you start to see that by the end of the 16th century, there is another profession that comes about, and they're called bodymakers. And so there's a lot of play on words about bodymakers and them making bodies. But these, again, are specialized tailors who just seem to specialize in making pairs of bodies. And so a lot of the ones that I've looked at in my research are located in around Cheapside in London. So Cheapside had a lot of different textile and garment making trades. And there's a lane, if anyone sort of knows the area that's listening quite well, called Boleyn, which you can still walk down. And there was a lot of body makers who were in Boleyn. So yeah, that's where a lot of the artisans in this period are working by the end of the 16th century. And they sort of stay there during the 17th, for most of the 17th century as well, until obviously the Great Fire of London. That area sort of gets quite destroyed, and there's a lot of different things that happen after that. But yeah, these are really like fascinating artisans, and the way that it changes and the way that they specialize. And what I found was there was quite a lot of overlap between these artisans, in that some people are calling themselves farthingale makers at certain stages of their career, and then they call themselves body makers. And so there seemed to be a lot of switching going on between what they choose to call themselves, depending on what is fashionable. So yeah, really, really fascinating trades. And there's a lot of like interesting characters. I mean, he's not in the 16th century, but he's in the 17th century. There's one guy who's a body maker. His name is Theophilus Riley. And I think that's what first made me remember him, because his name is so unique. But the more I dug into him, the more it was really interesting. So he was, an early corset maker. He was a body maker, and he had a couple of shops in Cheapside and Boleyn, but he became caught up in different royalist plots during the civil wars, and he ended up in the Tower of London for a little while. And yeah, just like totally like fascinating people that are
so intriguing.
Yeah.
I love that. I didn't know that they specialized in just making bodies or just making farthingales. So that's really interesting. And I just out of curiosity, are these people coming from overseas? I know a lot of the other artisans obviously came from Europe and other places. Did you find any information about that?
Yeah, so a lot of the ones that I looked at actually seem to be homegrown. So a lot of them are English from London. There's a lot of people especially by the late 16th and 17th centuries, coming in actually from the different counties into London and being trained in London. And some of them go back to their respective counties, and others stay in London. So there's a lot of migration that way. But for the most part, in terms of body and farthingale makers, most of them seem to be English. But that's not, Elizabeth did have different people coming in. Elizabeth loved French tailors. So, and you can definitely tell that she's often sending to France to get, these sorts of influences coming from France. But yeah, definitely during the 16th and the early 17th centuries, the body makers and farthingale makers that I've looked at all seem to be mostly English. My new work is sort of looking at the wardrobe accounts of the Stuart queens in the 17th century. And a lot of those queens have French tailors and mantua makers and seamstresses. And that's really because it's really the 16th century is the Spanish sort of dominate, I guess. There's always this discussion in England in the 16th century that England doesn't have its own style, that it just takes clothing from everywhere, which is quite true, actually. And so that's where you get things like French bodies or Spanish farthingales or Italian gowns. Often things are named after where that influence has come from. But you, don't tend to get a lot of the artisans. But definitely by the end of the 17th century, when the French were really like the trendsetters in Europe and remained so during the 18th century, that's when you really get a lot of French tailors and dressmakers that seem to be sort of headhunted and brought over.
We've been talking about some of these ideals that, women aspired to, or that women were expected to fulfill. So how do these ideals still influence Western society today, do you think?
They do in so many ways. And I think it's such an interesting question to think about, because I think a lot of, the feedback I tend to get from people when I speak about this, and this is definitely something that, I thought before I started studying this topic, is I think we think that we are so much more progressive than people in the past. And so I tend to get these, corsets, they were so bad for women, they, this and this and this, without sort of really thinking about the ways that we still are influenced by these garments now. So we still have shapewear. I imagine that there are many women out there and those listening that own a pair of Spanx in there, and that is basically, the 21st century equivalent of a foundation garment. It's designed to create a certain foundation for your clothing. So whether that is to smooth out lumps and bumps, or, now we've got so many different types of shapewear. Some can, lift your bum, some can do various different things. And that's exactly what these garments are during this period. So we still do things like that. We still use plastic surgery, for example, and I mean, you could argue that that's almost worse, because we're doing, I don't have a skin in the game either way. I find it just interesting the way that humans want to constantly change their bodies. But, in the period in the 16th century, you would use a farthingale to make it look like you have a bigger bum. Now we actually use surgery. So I think there's a lot of really interesting sort of connections you can make between the ways that we try to change our bodies now and the way that, women are still viewed, or the way that we view corsetry that sort of really start in this period. I think we reflect back and we go, oh, they were so silly. But I'm sure in 200 years, people will look back at what we're doing now to our bodies and be like, oh, that was so silly. So yeah, I think there's a lot of influence still in that regard, in terms of body shaping, in terms of the way that we still desire certain silhouettes, and the way that silhouettes change throughout history, the desirability of whether you're emphasizing the butt or the waist or the breast, for example. I don't think it's ever really gone away, and I think a lot of the ideas we have now can sort of be traced back to this earlier period.
Just starting to wrap up the conversation. So obviously you've done a lot of research into this subject. You've spent a lot of time immersed in all the sources and everything. What are some of the misconceptions that you've encountered while you've been researching and writing?
I think the biggest misconception is sort of related to what we were just talking about. This idea that we are so much better than people were in the past, and people in the past were so silly, in the way that we sort of, I think we project a lot onto the past without understanding the context. So I think one of the biggest misconceptions would be that these garments were so uncomfortable, and how did women live their life in them, and men forced women into wearing them and stuff like that. So I did a lot of reconstructions, and in my research, and in my my downtime, I like to sew, and I do reconstruct historical dress. And so I'm used to wearing I've sort of worn these garments before. I've put them on models to wear them to assess sort of restrictiveness and stuff like that. And they're really not as bad as people think they are. Of course, to our modern sensibilities, we've just spent 2 years in a pandemic, most of us, I'm sure, at home wearing track pants and stuff like that. I mean, I literally got an hoodie the other day, and it's the best thing I've ever I'm like, why didn't this come into my life sooner? So our ideas of what is comfortable are so drastically different. And I was, talking to a colleague about this the other day, and I would say the biggest difference between early modern dress, although even 20th century versus earlier, is that in the past, your body was expected to conform to dress. And that's because you didn't have things like stretch in clothing. You know, that's having stretch fibers in fabric is only been around for the last, 50 to 70 years. So this ability for your clothing to move and to change with your body is a very modern thing. So in the past, your body was expected to conform to dress. And that's why you have things like foundation garments that molded your body. And, men wore padded doublets and stuff like that, because your body was expected to conform to dress. Whereas now we expect our dress to conform to our body because we have things like stretch in our fabric. We have different we have princess seams. You have all these different sort of cuts and tailoring and, the bias, for example, the bias gown, that was invented in the 20s, putting fabric on the bias can give it a bit of stretch, but that was really when we started to experiment with stuff like that quite, a lot. And so I think that is, that was sort of one of my biggest, I guess, surprises or reflections, was really thinking about the way that modern ideas of our bodies and of comfort, how we sort of project those onto the past when they had really different views. I was talking to someone recently about how if I went and spoke to women now and I said, are you like short-waisted or long-waisted? A lot of women wouldn't know the answer to that. And that was because we don't really have a lot to do with the making of our clothing anymore. And, even in the 19th century, when corsetry became mass-produced, you would still have to, if you were sort of getting fitted for a corset, you would have to know whether you were short-waisted or you're long-waisted and stuff like that. So there is a bit of a disconnect. And I think that leads to a lot of ideas about the past that aren't necessarily true. So as I said, like these garments, they're not, comfortable to modern respects, but they're also not like incredibly uncomfortable either. I always say to people, the 17th century bodies, for example, or the style is quite off the shoulder, and actually having that off the shoulder style is more restrictive than the actual boning in the garment, because that means you can't move your arms. And I'd say the other biggest misconception that I found was there seems to be a lot of misconceptions about the idea that like men forced women to wear these garments, all through the history of corsetry, for example, or forced them to wear farthingales and stuff like that. But during this period, the majority of voices are men's voices, and a lot of men are talking about how much they hate these garments and that they wish women wouldn't wear them, and oh my God, why are women wearing them? And of course, there's like two layers here, right? There is the layer of living in a patriarchal society where women are expected to look a certain way, to appeal to men. And so, yes, if you aren't tall, if you aren't slender and straight and slim, you will turn to certain garments, to makeup, to things like that, to fit your society's definition of how a woman should look, which is often, dictated by men, but is also dictated by women as well. And still now women feel the need to conform to a particular look to please people around them. But so they've got that layer of this sort of unconscious, subconscious idea of like, which, men do have a hand in dictating how women should look. But this idea of this overt, like, no, you need to wear a corset is totally wrong for this period. It's the majority of discussions about how much they hate corsets and they wish women wouldn't wear them. And, what are women trying to hide under corsets? What are they trying to hide under farthingales? That comes from men. And quite nasty things, these men will say about women, yet women continue to wear these garments. Yeah. So there's sort of this real disconnect. And that was something I was really interested in exploring. It's like, okay, well, what did these garments actually mean for women? And, it's got to do with things like keeping up with the Joneses, with beauty, with marking your sort of social status, but also, needing support. You need breast support. They don't have bras during this period. So practical as well as social and cultural ideas.
That's so fascinating. And just what you were saying about the stretchy material, I've never thought of that. Poor things with no comfy trackies to get into. Or
tell people like I wear vintage clothes, and
yes,
I have skirts from the 50s and 60s. They don't have any stretch.
They don't stretch at all. I was thinking the same thing because I love clothes from the 40s, but I find it so hard to find anything that I can fit into unless I'm going to go and put on foundation garments, which I don't usually wear. But it's so true.
It makes you so much more aware of your body and how it changes over the day, over the month, like your fluctuations in, like, if you eat a big meal, like suddenly the waistband is really tiny and you're like, ah. So we're not, I don't think we're as aware of our bodies now because of stretch and clothing and the way that they fluctuate.
That is so fascinating, Sarah. This has been such a really fascinating discussion. Before I let you run away, where can listeners find out about you and your work if they want to go and explore a little bit more?
I'm on various social media. So I'm on Instagram as Sarah Bendall _fashion history. I have my own website and blog. So it's sort of Sarah with a H, a Bendall, BENDALL.com. So there I've got different blog posts about different things. I've got links to all my social media, to a gallery of all my reconstructions, to lots of different things. So that's probably the best place to start. And then if you're interested in reading my book, if you just Google Shaping Femininity, Sarah Bendall, you get a great preview on Google Books, and you can go to all your favorite bookstores to buy it.
Fantastic. So I'll add some links to the show notes to make it easy for people to find. And I'm going to go and have a look now at your reconstructions, you clever, clever woman. And thank you so much for taking part in this podcast special, All Things 16th Century Women. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
No, thanks so much for having me. It's been really, really great.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.